When they told Grandma Helen she was going to a nursing home, they said it gently, as if soft words could dull the meaning. They told her it was for her own safety, that the house was too big, the stairs too dangerous, and the nights too quiet for someone her age. Helen listened without interrupting, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face calm in a way that unsettled everyone in the room. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply nodded, as if she had known this day was coming long before anyone else dared to say it out loud. Helen had lived in that house for nearly 60 years. She had buried a husband from its living room, raised children in its narrow halls, and watched seasons change from the same kitchen window until the glass itself had grown old. The house held her life in its walls, but her children no longer saw that. To them, the house was a risk. Helen was a responsibility, and the nursing home was a solution. The first night after the decision was made, Helen sat alone at the dining table long after everyone had gone to bed. She traced the wood with her fingers, feeling every scratch and dent left behind by decades of living. She remembered arguments, laughter, and silence all occupying the same space at different times. What hurt most wasn't leaving the house. It was realizing that her children believed she had already stopped living in it. The move happened quickly. Boxes were packed by other people, decisions made without her input. Helen was placed in the passenger seat of her son's car with a small suitcase and a coat she didn't need. As they drove away, she didn't turn around to look at the house. She had learned long ago that looking back made leaving harder, and she had already spent a lifetime learning how to leave quietly. The nursing home smelled like disinfectant and overcooked food. The hallways were too bright, the smiles too practiced. Helen noticed how people spoke louder than necessary, slower than necessary, as if age had dulled her ability to understand. She smiled politely and answered when spoken to, but inside, she felt something tightening. Not fear, not sadness, determination. Her room was small, clean, and impersonal. A bed, a dresser, a chair by the window. No history.
No echoes.
Just space. Helen unpacked slowly, placing her clothes neatly, setting a framed photograph of her younger self and her husband on the dresser. She sat on the bed afterward, listening to unfamiliar sounds through the walls, realizing she was surrounded by people who had all been sent here for the same reason. They had lived too long to be convenient. The first few days passed quietly. Helen observed more than she spoke. She noticed how some residents stared endlessly at televisions that no one watched with them, how others rang call buttons that took far too long to be answered. She saw frustration disguised as patience, loneliness hidden behind routine. Most of all, she noticed how invisible everyone was. Staff moved quickly, efficiently, but rarely looked anyone in the eye for longer than a second. Helen wasn't invisible by accident. She made herself that way. She followed rules, ate meals on time, took her medication without complaint. She became the kind of resident no one worried about. And because no one worried about her, no one watched her closely. At night, when the lights dimmed and the halls grew quiet, Helen sat by her window and listened. She listened to muffled cries from other rooms, to arguments whispered behind doors, to the sound of loneliness moving through the building like a living thing. It reminded her of something she hadn't felt in years. Purpose. One evening, during dinner, a woman at the next table dropped her spoon and began to cry softly, embarrassed by the attention it drew. No one moved to help her right away. Helen stood up before she could stop herself. She picked up the spoon, wiped it clean, and placed it gently back in the woman's hand. The woman looked up, startled, then smiled through tears. It was a small moment, insignificant to everyone else. But something shifted inside Helen. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the years she had been told her best days were behind her. About how easily her family had decided she was done contributing. About how quickly a life could be reduced to a room number and a schedule. And for the first time since arriving, Helen felt something stronger than resignation. She felt resolve. By the end of the week, the staff would still think of her as the quiet old woman in room 214. They had no idea what she was about to change. Helen learned the rhythm of the nursing home the way she had once learned the rhythm of her own house, by paying attention to the quiet moments most people ignored. She noticed when the night nurse changed shifts and which hallway lights flickered before being replaced. She memorized the sound of the meal carts long before they reached her door and could tell which days the kitchen was short-staffed by the taste of the soup. The building followed rules, but it also followed habits, and habits were far easier to understand than people. During the day, Helen sat in common areas with a book she didn't always read, listening instead to the conversations around her. Residents spoke in fragments, repeating stories that no one finished hearing. Staff responded kindly but quickly, their smiles fading the moment they turned away. Helen didn't blame them. She had raised children, worked long hours, and known exhaustion that came from caring too much for too long. But she also knew what happened when caring became mechanical. She began with small gestures. She remembered names when others didn't. She listened to stories without correcting timelines or rushing endings. She learned which residents had family that visited and which ones stopped being mentioned at all. She discovered that one man down the hall had been a teacher and still corrected grammar in his head, that a woman near the window had been a pianist and pressed her fingers against the arm of her chair as if keys still lived there. These details mattered. They reminded Helen that everyone here had been someone long before they became a patient. Staff members started noticing her not because she demanded attention, but because other residents gravitated toward her. Meals that were usually quiet became livelier at her table. People sat straighter when she asked how their day had been. Nurses lingered a few seconds longer in rooms she had visited, as if her presence made them more aware of their own. Helen never gave orders. She asked questions. And questions, she knew, had a way of changing behavior without resistance. One afternoon, a new resident arrived, confused and angry, his voice echoing down the hallway as aides tried to guide him to his room. Most people looked away. Helen didn't. She stood up and walked toward him slowly, speaking calmly, introducing herself, telling him that the place felt strange at first, but that he wasn't alone. Her tone wasn't professional or practiced. It was human. The man's anger softened into exhaustion. He allowed himself to be led away, and the hallway exhaled. That moment stayed with the staff. They began asking Helen to sit with residents who were difficult, not because it was her responsibility, but because she seemed to understand something they didn't have time to learn. Helen agreed when she could and declined when she was tired, setting boundaries without apology. She had spent her life caring for others without recognition. This time, she chose intention over obligation. Behind the scenes, Helen noticed more troubling things. Call buttons unanswered for too long. Medications delivered late. Residents spoken to as if they weren't fully present. None of it was dramatic enough to cause alarm, but taken together, it formed a pattern of neglect disguised as efficiency. Helen didn't confront anyone. She wrote things down instead. Times. Names. Patterns. She had learned long ago that memory alone was fragile, but records were powerful. She also noticed how families behaved during visits. How some came with guilt wrapped in gifts, staying just long enough to feel forgiven. How others avoided eye contact altogether, dropping off clean laundry like an obligation fulfilled. Helen watched them carefully, recognizing pieces of herself in their discomfort. They weren't cruel, she realized. They were afraid. Afraid of becoming what they were trying not to see. Weeks passed, and Helen's room became a quiet gathering place. People stopped by to talk, to sit, to feel less alone. Someone brought a deck of cards. Another brought an old radio. Laughter, rare and hesitant at first, began to appear more often. The building didn't change, but the atmosphere did. Something human was growing in a place designed to be functional. The administration noticed the shift in subtle ways. Complaints dropped. Incidents decreased. Families commented on improved morale, without understanding why. No one credited Helen directly. They credited routine, scheduling, luck. Helen didn't correct them. She wasn't interested in recognition. She was interested in impact. Late one night, Helen sat with a woman who was dying and afraid to be alone. She held her hand and listened as the woman spoke about a life no one else had asked about in years. When the woman passed quietly just before dawn, Helen stayed until the staff arrived. She said nothing, but the nurse who found her there later told the story to others, her voice shaking with respect. That was when things began to change more noticeably. Staff started asking Helen's opinion. They asked which residents needed more attention, which ones responded better to certain routines. They didn't realize it yet, but they were listening to someone who had already taken responsibility for the soul of the place. Helen knew she was walking a careful line. She wasn't in charge. She had no authority. And yet, influence has a way of growing when it's rooted in care rather than control. She had no intention of stopping. What Helen was building quietly inside the nursing home wasn't rebellion. It was awakening. And it was only the beginning. By the time the administration realized something deeper was happening, the nursing home no longer felt like the same place it had been when Helen first arrived. It wasn't louder or brighter, and the walls hadn't changed color, but the way people moved through the building had shifted. Conversations lasted longer. Staff paused instead of rushing. Residents who had once stayed hidden in their rooms now appeared in common spaces, drawn by a sense of belonging they couldn't quite explain. Helen never announced plans or called meetings. She worked in moments. She suggested instead of insisted. When a nurse mentioned being overwhelmed, Helen listened and shared how she once managed exhaustion when caring for her own children and aging parents at the same time. When an aide complained that residents were uncooperative, Helen reminded her gently that fear often looked like resistance. Her words didn't sound like instruction. They sounded like understanding. What no one knew was that Helen was still writing everything down. The notebook she kept hidden in her drawer had grown thick with observations. Not accusations. Patterns. Which shifts struggled most. Which residents were repeatedly overlooked. Which staff members tried harder than they were supported. She didn't see villains. She saw a broken system quietly wearing everyone down. One afternoon, a family arrived unannounced and found their mother sitting alone, her lunch untouched, her call button blinking unanswered. The argument that followed was loud enough to draw attention. Management stepped in quickly, apologizing, explaining, promising review. Helen watched from a distance, already knowing that this incident wouldn't disappear the way others had. Families listened differently when anger replaced guilt. That evening, Helen was asked to speak with the director. The request was polite, casual, framed as appreciation for her positive influence. Helen went willingly, her notebook left behind. The director spoke about morale, about improvements, about how residents seemed more engaged lately. Helen listened, nodding, letting the words settle before responding. When she finally spoke, she didn't criticize. She asked whether the administration truly wanted to know why things felt different. The director hesitated, then said yes. Helen spoke calmly, carefully. She talked about attention, about presence, about how small moments of dignity changed everything. She didn't mention neglect directly. She described absence. Absence of time. Absence of listening. Absence of humanity. The director listened longer than expected, his expression shifting from polite interest to discomfort. Helen stopped before pushing too far. She had learned that truth landed harder when people discovered it themselves. After that meeting, changes came slowly, but intentionally. Staffing schedules were adjusted. Training sessions were extended. New policies were introduced, framed as improvements rather than corrections. Helen was never named as the source, but her influence was embedded in every change. Staff members began seeking her out, not as a superior, but as someone who saw them. Then came the inspection. The state inspection was announced weeks in advance, sending a ripple of anxiety through the building. Administrators reviewed files, staff rehearsed protocols, residents were reminded to follow routines. Helen watched the preparation with quiet concern. Inspections, she knew, measured compliance, not care. And care was harder to stage. On the day of the inspection, Helen did something unexpected. She encouraged residents to speak honestly if asked. Not angrily, not defensively. Honestly. Some were afraid. Others were eager. Helen reassured them that their voices mattered, even if they had been ignored before. When inspectors walked the halls, they noticed the atmosphere immediately. Residents spoke freely. Staff answered questions thoughtfully. Small inconsistencies emerged, then patterns. Nothing severe enough to cause shutdowns, but enough to demand accountability. Recommendations were made. Follow-ups scheduled. The nursing home passed, but just barely. The aftermath was tense. Management tightened oversight. Staff worried about blame. Helen worried about backlash. But something else happened instead. The director addressed the building openly, acknowledging gaps, thanking staff and residents alike for honesty. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't revolutionary. But it was rare. That night, Helen sat alone in her room, her notebook open. She reread early entries and barely recognized the place she had described. The transformation hadn't come from authority or protest. It had come from persistence, from refusing to disappear. What Helen didn't know yet was that her children had begun to hear things. Comments from visitors. Stories shared online. Mentions of a woman who had changed everything inside a nursing home they once thought was just a place to put their mother. The past was catching up to the present, and the truth they had avoided for years was about to confront them head-on. Helen's children didn't come rushing in with apologies or sudden understanding. Change, Helen knew, rarely arrived that way. It came hesitantly, wrapped in curiosity and doubt. Her daughter was the first to mention it, during a phone call that lingered longer than usual. She spoke about a coworker whose aunt lived in the same nursing home and had said something strange, something unexpected, about an older woman who seemed to know everyone, who sat with the lonely and spoke up without raising her voice. Helen listened quietly, saying little, letting the words unfold on their own. When her children finally visited together, it felt different. They walked slower through the halls, noticing things they hadn't before. Residents greeted Helen by name. Staff smiled at her with genuine warmth. Someone reached for her hand as she passed. None of this was staged. None of it was explained. It simply existed, undeniable and visible. They sat in her room, awkward at first, surrounded by traces of a life they had assumed was shrinking. Her son asked how she was doing, expecting the polite answer she had always given. Helen looked at him for a long moment before speaking. She told the truth. She spoke about loneliness, about being underestimated, about how close she had come to believing she no longer mattered. Her voice didn't shake. It didn't need to. The weight of her honesty filled the room. She didn't accuse them. She didn't list mistakes. She told them what she had learned instead. That purpose didn't retire. That dignity needed protection. That people didn't fade just because they aged. Her children listened, really listened, perhaps for the first time in years. Guilt surfaced, but so did something else. Respect. In the weeks that followed, the nursing home continued to change. Programs expanded. Resident councils formed. Families became more involved, not out of obligation, but out of connection. Helen stepped back where she could, encouraging others to lead, to speak, to care. She had never wanted control. She had wanted continuity. One afternoon, the director offered Helen a formal role, a title that came with recognition and responsibility. Helen declined politely. She explained that influence was strongest when it wasn't confined by position. She wanted to remain simply a resident, a voice, a presence. As time passed, Helen's health began to slow her, gently but inevitably. She spent more time resting, more time watching from her window. The notebook stayed closed now, its work done. Others had taken up the task she once carried alone. The system wasn't perfect, but it was awake. On a quiet morning, Helen passed peacefully, not alone, but surrounded by hands she had once held for others. News of her death spread quickly through the building. Staff paused. Residents mourned. Families asked questions. Stories were shared, then repeated, then remembered. Helen's children stood in the same hallway where they had once left her, realizing too late that they had sent her away instead of listening. But they also realized something else. She hadn't been sent to disappear. She had been sent to lead, even if no one had intended it. The nursing home placed a small plaque in the common room. It didn't list achievements or titles. It carried a simple message about kindness, attention, and the power of being seen. Most visitors never noticed it, but those who lived there always did. Because of Helen, they knew that being overlooked didn't mean being powerless. And sometimes, the place meant to end a life story becomes the chapter that changes everything.